3 campers vanished from the Appalachian Trail, and rangers can't believe what happened next. In June of 2017, deep in the Appalachian Mountains along a remote stretch near Standing Indian Mountain, North Carolina, 4 childhood friends set out on their 8th straight annual off-trail camping trip. By the end of that weekend, search teams had recovered all 3 missing men. But nothing about what they found made sense. One, 24 years old, sitting rigid against a tree half a mile from camp, eyes and mouth still open, a streak of white running through his hair that wasn't there the day before. The coroner's official cause, cardiac arrest. Off the record, he told the family the boy looked like he'd been scared to death. A second was found face down in a creek a quarter-mile away, water that never runs deeper than a man's knee in June. The third was recovered at the bottom of a 100-foot drop, broken in ways a fall alone doesn't usually explain. The fourth man made one phone call, a little after 1 a.m., his voice barely holding together, repeating his coordinates twice like he didn't trust himself to get them right. And then he had nothing left in him. Ranger Briggs found him exactly where that call had come from, flat on the ground at his own campsite, knees pulled to his chest. Brian looked up just long enough to say 3 words. It was her, and then nothing else, not for hours. What follows is the account he eventually gave, and what he meant by those 3 words doesn't make sense until the very end. His name is Brian, and it started 3 days earlier, the way it always did. "10 years on this ridge, and Brian had never heard the giggling before they'd even reached camp. High and thin through the trees, gone the second he turned toward it, closer to the trail than it had any business being. On ground nobody else was supposed to be hiking that June. Nick shoved him off the packed dirt. Stop being a baby, it's a bird. Carter went for the frayed bracelet on Brian's wrist instead. Same joke every year, the one his sister braided him the summer before she died out here. And all 4 peeled off the marked trail toward the same unmapped clearing they'd found their way back to for a decade. Brian built the fire without watching his own hands do it, stacking kindling the way his dad taught him, needing something to hold on to more than the warmth. The flames caught. The beer started doing exactly what 4 days off work wanted it to do. He caught it. Something at the edge of the firelight that wasn't firelight, gone the instant he looked straight at it. Underneath Nick's stories, footsteps kept pace past the tree line, matching them step for step, belonging to none of the 3 men across the fire. Carter's boot caught on something half buried near the fire ring. A girl's dress shoe, patent leather, buckle strap, not a scuff on it, like it had been set there instead of lost there. He held it up laughing, then chucked it into the dark. Brian didn't laugh. His thumb found the frayed bracelet instead, working it the way it always did when nobody was watching. And that's when strange things started to happen. Wood smoke was the only smell in camp, right up until it wasn't. Nick fed the fire another split log and said something about how 3 days into a 4-day permit meant nobody back home would think to worry until Thursday. Plenty of time to sleep off day 1 and still make the trailhead by noon. Carter laughed too hard at that, still riding the buzz from the first round, and for a second the whole night settled back into something normal. Then the fire went out. Not smoldered, not sputtered. Out. Flame to nothing, all at once, the air dead calm around them, and not one gust strong enough to take credit for it. Nick swore, dug the lighter out of his pocket, and had it going again inside a minute. Nobody said much about it. Fires did strange things sometimes, and none of them wanted to be the guy who made it weird. It went out a second time the exact same way, and that was when the giggling came back. High, delighted, close enough that all four of them heard it at once, not just Brian this time. Nick was on his feet before the sound even finished, screaming into the black tree line, "Who's there?" Nothing answered. Not a rustle, not a footstep, not the laugh again. Just Nick standing there breathing hard, knuckles white around a stick he didn't remember picking up, the fire catching a third time behind him, while four grown men suddenly got very interested in finishing their beers and calling it a night. The tents went up fast. Brian lay awake a long while listening to Carter snore through canvas, running his thumb over the bracelet in the dark, until his eyes finally gave out on him. He woke up soaked, cold water clinging to his shirt, the sleeping bag gone heavy and wrong against his skin, the zipper on his tent standing wide open to a flap of black night that hadn't been there when he fell asleep. Someone had unzipped it from the outside and dumped water straight onto him while he was under, and by the time his eyes adjusted, he still hadn't figured out which direction to point his anger before Nick's fist found his shoulder and shoved him flat again. "Real funny," Nick said, close enough that Brian could smell the beer still on his breath, already promising to knock every tooth out of his head for it. "Cool it. It wasn't him." Tim's voice cut through the dark before Brian could get a word out, flat and sure of itself in a way that made Nick go quiet for a second. "He's been asleep for an hour, man. I've been listening to him breathe the whole time." Tim didn't usually step in for anybody like this. That wasn't his role in the group, and everyone always knew it, which made the silence after he said it land differently than it should have. Nick looked at him a beat too long, jaw working, like he couldn't decide whether to be angrier about the water or about being told no in front of everybody. That was when the giggling came again. Right on cue, like it had been sitting back in the trees waiting for the argument to land somewhere before it interrupted. High, delighted, close. Nick spun toward the tree line and unloaded everything he had left in him, screaming threats into woods that swallowed the sound whole and gave nothing back. Nobody answered him this time either. Underneath the wood smoke and the wet canvas, Brian caught a thread of something sweet drifting in off the dark, out of place in a way he couldn't name, closer to a memory than a smell, gone before he could pin down where he knew it from. He'd know that smell by name before the weekend was over. He just didn't know it yet. He didn't tell the others. He lay back down, soaked through, listening to Nick pace the dirt outside the tent until sunrise finally showed up on its own schedule, no earlier than it felt like it had to. Nick had stormed off sometime after 3 a.m., and nobody went after him. That was just Nick. Everybody let him walk off his temper alone, same as every year. And by the time the sun cracked over the ridge, camp had settled into its normal, slow-motion morning. Carter frying the last of the bacon, Tim picking through his pack for aspirin, Brian rolling up his soaked sleeping bag and saying nothing about the water or the smell. Nobody mentioned Nick's empty sleeping bag until almost 10. Even then, nobody panicked. He'd done this before, stormed off mad, slept it off somewhere in the leaves, wandered back in smelling like a hangover with a grudge. 3 days into the same 4-day permit, and this wasn't the first year one of them had vanished for half a morning just to sulk it off. Tim stood up around 11 and said he needed to move. Down toward Kimsey Creek, he figured. Clear his head. No real reason given beyond that. He went alone. Nobody stopped him either. Brian watched him disappear past the tree line, thumb working the bracelet again, and didn't say the thing sitting in his throat. 3 hours passed. Neither one of them came back. Neither one of them would come back at all. Carter checked his watch for the 4th time and made the call. "I'll find them both. You stay here, get lunch going. We'll all walk back in together." Brian's mouth opened around the obvious answer. "We should go together. Splitting up is how people get lost out here." and then closed again without a word leaving it. He never argued. Not with Nick, not with Carter, not with anybody in this group since they were 14 years old. And some habits didn't quit just because his gut was screaming that this one mattered more than the rest of them ever had. Alone at the fire ring, his hands wouldn't sit still. He snapped kindling down into smaller and smaller pieces just to have something to do with his fingers, splinters biting into his palm, watching the tree line the whole time without meaning to. Every few minutes he caught himself listening for the giggle instead of dreading it, like some part of him had already accepted it was coming back. Fog rolled in without any front behind it, thick enough to swallow the far side of the clearing, and there hadn't been a cloud in the sky an hour earlier. It didn't drift so much as arrive, settling low and staying put around the edges of camp like it had somewhere specific to be. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took him to notice it happening, and the fire he'd built earlier that morning refused to throw off any real heat against it. A scream cut Carter's name off somewhere up the ridge. Brian was moving before he decided to move, legs carrying him toward the sound faster than his brain caught up. Branches raked both forearms raw on the way through, splitting skin he wouldn't notice until later. The trail he'd hiked 100 times bent wrong under his boots. He cut left toward the ridge and somehow ended up facing the same split boulder he'd already passed, twice, the ground tilting him back toward the drop-off, no matter which direction he tried to angle around it. His palms scraped raw bark climbing over a downed trunk, slick with morning dew. His boot caught a root, and he went down hard, gravel tearing straight through his jeans into his knee. And somehow he was back up and running again before the sting even fully registered. His lungs burned raw. His heart slammed hard enough that he felt it pounding in his own teeth. He didn't call out. Calling out felt like the wrong kind of noise to make right now, though he couldn't have said why. 10 long minutes in, the giggling reached him before Carter did. High, delighted, closer than it had ever gotten, drifting in from somewhere just ahead through the fog, right where the ground dropped away into nothing at all. Carter had his back to open air, heels an inch from 100 feet of nothing at Painter's Ledge, both hands out in front of him like he could push the whole world back with his palms. She was closer than that. Barefoot, filthy feet dark to the ankle with old dirt that hadn't washed off in years. A dress gone gray-yellow at the hem, buttons missing down one side. Her arms were too thin, wrists no wider than the bracelet Brian still hadn't stopped touching, and dark lines scored into her skin ran up both forearms in patterns that didn't look like scars so much as roots. Her hair hung tangled past her shoulders, knotted through with leaves she never bothered to clear out. Her face hadn't aged a single day past 6 years old. Same round cheeks, same gap where her front tooth used to be. Except for the eyes, which held something a 6-year-old's never should. She moved slow, unhurried, like she had all the time in 100 years and had already decided how this ended. She giggled. The same giggle from the fire, from the tent, from 3 days of trees that talked back. And Carter's foot found nothing but air behind him on the next step he didn't mean to take. There wasn't even a scream long enough to matter. She turned from the ledge like Carter had never been standing there at all, and the giggle followed her closer now, aimed somewhere past Brian's shoulder. Except there was nowhere past his shoulder for it to go. It was aimed at him. Brian's ankle folded on a stump he never saw, and the ground came up to meet his face before he understood he was falling. He clawed at wet leaves, got nothing but a fistful of mud, and by the time he twisted onto his back, she was already close enough to smell. Sweet and wrong. The exact same thread that had drifted through camp 2 nights running, except now he had a name for it. Baby lotion. The kind his mother kept in the bathroom cabinet for a girl who'd been gone 10 years. His stomach dropped through the floor of the world, mouth bone dry, every part of him wanting to run and none of him moving. The shoe. Patent leather, buckle strap, no scuff on it. Carter had thrown it laughing into the dark the first night, and Brian's brain had refused to connect it to anything until this exact second, watching her walk barefoot through the leaves toward him. His mother had buried Bree in a shoe just like it. Bree hated the sensible ones, always wanted the buckle, and their mother gave her that one last thing. "No," Brian said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to, more question than refusal. "No, no, no, Bree, no, you're not. This isn't—" He couldn't finish a sentence. 10 years of grief and disbelief crashed into each other behind his ribs, and he couldn't tell if the sound tearing out of him was fear or something closer to relief. He was crying before he understood he'd started, chest caving in, hands shaking too hard to push himself back through the mud. 10 years he'd told himself he was over it, a bee sting on a trip just like this one, an allergy nobody knew about until it was too late. A funeral in July with a shoe nobody thought twice about. 10 years, and here she was, kneeling in front of him with her head tilted the exact same way it always used to. Her fingers found the bracelet first, the one she'd braided him the summer before she died, frayed now from 10 years of his own thumb working the same spot without ever letting go, and traced it once before her palm settled warm and small against his shoulder. "It's okay, Bubby." His own name, the one only she ever called him, in the exact voice he'd spent a decade trying to forget, gentle and certain like nothing at all was wrong. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Underneath the sobbing tearing out of him, a second feeling sat right alongside the first, ugly and quiet and impossible to look at directly. Because she had spent this entire weekend clearing away every person who'd ever made her brother feel small, one by one, and he was still sitting there trying to decide if he was sorry she had. She stood, brushed leaves from a dress a decade too small for the woman she should have grown into, and walked back into the trees without another word. He never saw which direction she went. Rangers held Brian at the station for 11 long hours before they finally let him go. 3 words on tape, it was her, and nothing after that added up to a story any of them could file. A sister, a full decade gone. A girl in a party dress. Giggling in the trees that 4 grown men had each described the exact same way before they ever got the chance to compare notes with one another. Nothing in the file pointed to Brian. Nothing in the file explained a single one of the 3 bodies search teams pulled off that ridge over the following 4 days either. Nick came out of those woods first, cardiac arrest, a heart the coroner said looked as healthy at 24 as any heart he'd ever opened, and a streak of white through his hair that hadn't been there 3 days earlier and that nobody could account for. Tim came out of Kimsey Creek face down, in water that had never once in living memory run past a grown man's knee in June. Carter came last, from the bottom of Painter's Ledge, broken in ways that matched a 100-foot fall on paper, and raised more questions inside the search and rescue office than anyone ever put in writing. The case stayed open on paper, unresolved. As of this filming, it still is. Ranger Briggs never wrote down the other set of prints he found circling Brian's tent that night. Bare, small, a child's stride, walking off into the trees like whoever left them had somewhere else to be. On the drive home from the ranger station, Brian says he heard the giggling one more time, far off through the open truck window, and for the first time all weekend, it didn't make him afraid at all. Now here's the detail that never made it into any official report out of Standing Indian Mountain. I keep coming back to it because it's the one piece of this whole account nobody had to make up, and Briggs still chose to leave it out of the file entirely. Bree had been gone a full 10 years by the time that weekend ever happened, And for 10 years, Brian carried her the only way any of us carry the people we lose. A bracelet on his wrist, a habit of touching it whenever nobody's looking. What she came back and did for her brother in those Appalachian woods isn't something I can fully explain to you, and honestly, I don't think I'm supposed to be able to. But I'll say this much. There's something genuinely bittersweet about a guardian who never once asks permission first, about being protected by someone who loved you enough to do something you'd never have let her do, if she'd only stopped long enough to ask you first. So here's what I keep wondering, and I suspect you will too once the credits roll. If the sibling you lost came back one day and did that for you, cleared away everyone who had ever made you feel small, no explanation offered, no apology given for any of it, would you have said her name softly back to her? Or would you have turned around and run the other way instead? I still genuinely don't know, myself, which one of those two things I'd actually end up doing. I don't think Brian's fully decided either, not even a full 10 years later. Standing quietly at the edge of those same mountains, he still hasn't quite managed to stay away from.